Right, in identity, there's a lot of complicated words, and I made a new one up here with UnOAuthorized. As mentioned, I'm Eric Woodruff. I currently am a senior security researcher at Semperis. My social media handles, if you have questions about this or just anything identity related and want to reach out after the talk, feel free. I come from the blue side, so it's a bit boring, but it's easy to remember. Right, and as far as the name goes, right, if you take unauthorized, which is a bit of foreshadowing, and combine it with OAuth 2, which is sort of the modern way to authorize, cloud things these days, right? You come up with UnOauthorized, and hat tip to myself, because neither marketing nor AI helped with this. But to kind of get into the background of things, there's already been plenty of research around Entra ID app permissions and roles, right? And here's just a smattering of like 8 different articles sort of out there around app registrations and service principals. And you may recognize some of these people or not, but you should, right? And ultimately, app registration, service principals, it's an area that even a lot of identity people don't really have a strong grasp of. And it's a great way to gain a foothold into a tenant, right? A lot of research around this kind of spurred up again after the whole Midnight Blizzard thing that happened earlier this year with Microsoft, right? So, and ultimately, right, when we're talking about owning the cloud, if you're more familiar with domain admins, right, like global admin is the thing that we ultimately want to get to, or global admin equivalent, because then it's just going to be a bad day for everyone, if you're M365, Azure, sort of whatever you have in your Microsoft estate, right, if you get global admin popped, it's going to be game over. So because this is a bit complex, I just want to set the stage so we're all kind of speaking the same language, have the same understanding around a few key components here for the research and the findings. Right, so first off, just want to mention the application administrator role. Right, so we have our Entra tenant, Entra ID, and we have the app admin or cloud application administrator role. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to refer to both roles as application administrator, but either of them are sort of in the scope of impact here, right? So we have these roles, and we have a user that we assign application administrator to, right? And effectively, that role exists to manage applications within a tenant, right? So this way, we're not delegating things like global admin out to everyone. You have your app admins, and they can do things like manage the lifecycle and onboard, SAML and OpenID Connect and all your SaaS apps like Salesforce and Workday and multi-cloud and on and on. Right, but these are like swim lanes roles, right? Or if you're on the highway and there's a solid line, like you're basically only allowed to stay within that realm, right? So one thing an app admin in a greenfield tenant can't do is manage other roles, right? They're going to be blocked, they're going to get a 403 unauthorized from Graph. So speaking about applications, right? If you've been around the block for a while, this may look familiar, and it is, right, the services control panel in Windows. And essentially there's a lot of stuff in here, right, as a consumer or user of Windows you don't necessarily need to know or care about, just as long as whatever is supposed to be running is running, right? Things effectively work. And we essentially have the same in the cloud, right? So there are some things that may look familiar, like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, right? The Azure portal, M365 admin portal as, services and service principals in your tenant. But you'll also find that there are hundreds and hundreds of other service principals that, Microsoft sort of puts out there that, again, for the most part, you don't need to know or care about for your Microsoft cloud estate to work. So jumping into this application thing a bit more, in particular, we're going to talk about multi-tenant applications. And it's important to understand this to really kind of gain a grasp of the discovery and the research here, right? So in a hypothetical scenario, I'm publishing software, right? I'm a SaaS provider, and I want to publish software. And so I have a tenant, an Entra tenant. And in that, I create an app registration, right? And on that app registration, I give it some name, and I also assign permissions to it. So here we have, user read write all, directory read write all, and group read all, right? And effectively, as the developer, I'm saying these are the permissions that my application needs to do whatever it is that it's supposed to do. And then I assign credentials to it, right? And this can either be a secret, which is effectively like a password for applications, or I can assign, asymmetric key pair, right, certificates to that app registration. So once I have that defined in Entra, right, then effectively I go build my application again. It doesn't really matter, and it's not, relevant to the discovery, but right, there's services out there, Kubernetes and AWS, Azure, PaaS. It doesn't matter sort of what or where, but this application, right, has a relationship because you have the client ID that you give to the application, as well as a tenant ID, and the credential, right, and effectively now this application can sort of do, again, whatever you've defined. But I need customers, right, or else I'm going to go out of business. So, right, customer tenant comes along, I want this piece of software, and sort of high level, a global admin will come in, and they go to that application, and they perform what's called an admin consent or an admin consent grant, right? And in this process, they create what is called a service principal in their sort of consuming tenant, right? And the service principal is a security principal, right? So if you think of like users, they're also a security principal. You can assign permissions and roles and things like that to them. And in this instance, right, the service principal is that security principal that represents that application, and it has those same permissions, right? So we're effectively saying, yes, like, we're good with letting this application do whatever these things are within the tenant. So we have this relationship defined. But to really be able to use that relationship, right, then we're going to go call, usually these days, Microsoft Graph, right? And to Graph, we're going to authenticate to our tenant, and as long as authentication works okay, we're going to get an access token back. And then we're going to pass that access token off to Graph and effectively be able to do, again, whatever the stuff is that the developer has defined. So when we look at Microsoft applications, right, Microsoft has their own tenant with app registrations and all this stuff. And basically everyone that is consuming Microsoft services, again, Azure, right, M365, you all have Entra tenants sitting underneath this, right, and they all have these service principals. Now, since we don't work for Microsoft, or I don't, right, you have to sometimes infer things because you don't actually have the ability to see behind the curtain. But for the most part, these things operate very similar to if I was sort of an external, software developer, right? And so in this example, we have device registration service. And again, right, it has a client ID, it has a credential assigned to it. And it can authenticate to a tenant, and it can get an access token back, right? And it could, if in theory it needed to talk to Graph for something, pass it along, and right, and again, go do whatever the stuff is that device registration service is supposed to be allowed to do. But again, I will highlight, right, just that there are lots of other APIs out there, both sort of known and sort of unknown that Microsoft has. But for the focus of the research, it's really around Graph, right? So moving on to the research, what I was interested in was impersonating Microsoft applications. And what I really mean here is actually acting as Microsoft service principals for multi-tenant applications, but like that's a huge mouthful, right? But you could think of it as impersonating these applications or borrowing their identity, right? Effectively, I want to act as these applications. So the interesting thing in the space of service principals and app registrations, right, is while the developer has credentials on the app registration, we can also assign credentials to the service principal, right? And we can take these credentials that we have on our service principal and impersonate, right, whatever that application is, potentially. So here, the impersonating application is just going to be, something easy like PowerShell using the Microsoft Graph SDK. And we're going to take that client ID, the tenant ID, the credential, right? And now we can come out and essentially authenticate, and as long as it goes well, get our access token, pass it along to Graph, and again, do whatever the stuff is. And the focus here, and this sort of flow, is an OAuth 2 client credential grant flow. Yet another mouthful. You may see me shorthand it to CCGF, just to make things, fit on the screen here. And this may seem a little reiterative, but just, again, to sort of help enforce how these flows work, right? If we sort of take away the Entra piece and just abstract out, what an OAuth 2 client credential grant flow looks like, but effectively the application requests an access token from Entra with the client ID and credential, right? And again, it gets that access token back, assuming that there's nothing wrong with the authentication. The application calls Microsoft Graph with that access token, On the back end, again, where we can't see things, Graph validates the access token, and then it returns the requested data, right? So when we're talking about interacting with Graph, if it's a GET, right, that's we're trying to read data from Graph, read data from M365 or, Entra, right? If it's going to be a post, that's like we're trying to put data out there, and a patch is usually updating data. So a few things to note with this, right, is that in a client credential grant flow, the .default scope is the only scope permitted by Microsoft Graph. And I just highlight this because there's some other sets of research out there around OAuth and things like that where, there's ways to try to influence the scope. In this instance, the scope is sort of what it is, and you may say, well, what the heck is a scope? Right, and a scope is the application permissions defined in the app registration. So right within the OAuth spec, scope effectively equals permissions. It's usually easier to understand, right, the term permissions, but if you see scope, permissions, you can sort of use them interchangeably. But default scope does not indicate additional permissions provided by other authorization systems, and this we could possibly call foreshadowing. So right, we kind of have our theory, and now we want to look for applications to impersonate, and my very sort of poor code here, right, just very simply going to take all the service principals within my tenant, and I can easily find these by looking for the app owner tenant ID, which is Microsoft, and this is baked onto any sort of service principal for a multi-tenant application. Right, when I get all these, then I'm just dumping them through a for each, and essentially adding a credential to the service principal, and just very poorly dumping it out to a CSV so that I could use it later. Now, the focus here is on secrets, right, effectively passwords, but I also kind of ran through all this with certificates as well, because there is some cases where you'd see different behavior. And once I have that, I have this CSV, and like I was mentioning earlier, right, that there's lots and lots of service principals in a tenant from Microsoft, right? This one tenant I was working with has 573. I've seen tenants with higher, I've seen tenants with lower, right? But essentially whatever service you consume that is using, OAuth within the Microsoft world is, going to have a service principal in your tenant. So I've got the list, and it's great, but that doesn't really mean anything yet. Right, so now we're just going to loop through things here and essentially just stuffing in, again, PowerShell into credential object, right, the password and client ID for the service principal, and then we're just connecting to Graph. And right, again, here we're connecting to our tenant, whatever the target is. And in this, sort of research, again, I just was running get mg context, which effectively tells you the permissions that are available to you, and just dumping out to a text file, which I'm now highlighting there, right? And that was about it. And so out of the 573 applications in, or service principals in my tenant, found that 9 actually supported the OAuth 2 client credential grant flow, right? But just supporting that and being able to authenticate in itself is sort of like, again, who cares, right? So it was really looking for the right scopes. Now, there are other, bits of research out there where you can have very permissive read access. But I was really focused on right scopes, trying to move into a tenant, gaining persistence, sort of, moving privilege up, elevating privilege, all that sort of stuff, right? So I was really interested in the right scopes, and what I effectively found is that 4 of these service principals had some right scopes defined on them. But even if you look at these names and you go sort of look at the docs and see what they mean, none of this was really actually all that super interesting. There was one application, rights management services, that didn't have any right scopes, but it did have read scopes. And then 4 applications that had no scopes whatsoever, right? And again, honestly, this sort of bit of research isn't that mind-blowing. As I was going through this, I talked with some other researchers, and everyone's kind of come up with this list of 9 applications, and it's not really all that crazy. But I guess where things sort of differed for me is I decided to, right, try privileged things anyways, right? And these privileged things include disabling a regular user, privileged user, but again, regardless of what scopes or permissions I have available to me, changing a privileged user's password, managing role assignments, creating a user, deleting a user, and deleting a privileged user, permanently deleting a privileged user, creating a group eligible for role assignment, creating an administrative unit, and managing role-assigned group membership. And I've spent a lot of time sort of working on the blue side of things and have worked with a lot of enterprises. And so I was trying to think like, well, what are the different ways that if I have some privilege in Entra that I might be able to gain more privilege? And this was kind of the list that I had come up with. Right? So the results. Now, obviously, I wouldn't be here, probably standing in front of you, if there wasn't something interesting coming out of all this. So if we go to that application administrator role, again, where we can't manage roles, we actually found a way that an app admin can become global administrator or actually can become any other role they want within the tenant. And so if we take device registration service, this service principal that exists in our tenant, and as discussed, we go assign a credential to it that we now know, hop out to something like PowerShell again, go out to PowerShell with our service principal, client ID, our tenant ID, that credential, and actually found that we could manage any role in an Entra tenant, And while a lot of organizations may set themselves up in ways to kind of shoot themselves in the foot, in a greenfield tenant, this should not be allowed. We go back to those sort of swim lanes. And unfortunately, this piece in particular, Microsoft fixed up so quick that I was hoping to get a video of this happening, but when I went to try it out, they'd already resolved it. So I do fortunately have some screenshots, and again, just gonna kind of walk through everything from start to finish here, So we have that target service principal of device registration service, And again, we're just taking the credentials and stuffing them into a cred object in PowerShell, And then we're going to connect to Graph with our tenant ID and the client ID within here. So once we're connected, that get MG context that I mentioned earlier, we run this and we can see that as far as Entra is concerned, that we are device registration service, That's what it thinks we are as far as it's concerned. And we can see that we have no scopes assigned to us here, So I should get a 403 unauthorized, sort of regardless of what I attempt to do. But I found that we had some read access, So I was able to do get MG directory role and effectively get all the roles in the directory. And again, the focus kind of on global administrator, because that's the sort of worst case scenario. And we can also get role membership, So get MG directory role member. And I have two identities in here that are two different global admins. But then I also found that I could run get MG user, and in this case, the target's Megan Bowen, and I just really want her object ID, Because what we're going to do is take this stuff and just, splat it into an array that effectively has the role definition ID for global admin, her object ID, and the directory scope is just sort of the root because you can't assign global admin to an administrative unit. Right, and now we're going to run another mouthful, new MG role management directory role assignment, where we're effectively trying to make Megan a global admin. So we run it, and we don't get a 403 response. Right, we actually receive data back from Graph, and at first I'm like, huh. So I run get MG context, and I'm like, yep, I'm still device registration service. I'm still operating under that context, and there are still no scopes. Right? To me, this is not a good look. We also found that we can, actually before I get to that part, right, if we run get MG directory role member, we can again see here that we now have 3 global admins in our Entra tenant. And I also found that we could remove global admins as well, right? So not only can we add role membership, we can remove role membership. So in this example, right, I had gotten the unified role assignment ID for another global admin and remove them. And then afterwards, we can get directory role membership and see that one of my global admins is now gone. And a bit of an interesting side note is with this sort of role management permission on an application, you can actually evict all global admins in a tenant. That isn't unique to this finding, but from an application, you can actually get rid of all your GAs if you really wanted to live dangerously. So back to the findings, right? Then go into Entra, again, looking at sort of our results in our audit logs, right? We sort of see the success here, right? Add member to role, successful for global administrator from device registration service. And I ended up running through this on like 3 or 4 different tenants because I just was, I don't know, my one tenant's a dump and you're never really sure, right, sort of what you're dealing with when you have labs, but found that I kept having the same sort of findings here. But along with device registration service, I also found that Viva Engage, which is formerly known as Yammer for the like 3 people here that maybe have used it, that you can actually delete and permanently delete privileged users as well. And rights management services had the ability to create users. So, what was Microsoft's response to this? So for device registration service, this was marked as an important severity in the identity bounty program with privilege elevation. And this one, again, was resolved relatively quick. Viva Engage ended up getting a medium severity, which this is also resolved. And rights management services was low severity, again, resolved. Now, I think if you look at the principle of things, right, when you're talking about authorization, I would still argue that these are all a high severity thing, because if we think of AuthZ, right, authorization and those swim lanes we're supposed to be in, right, it's a bit scary if the sort of thing that you believe is actually what you're permitted to do or not do is not actually accurate, right? So I had a bit of back and forth with MSRC, sort of disagreeing with their findings, but the important part is that these things were resolved. But I did ask, why did this function, right? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me, again, as an outsider who doesn't have the ability to see behind the curtain, right? You're thinking, like, is there some sort of, defect or flaw, which, they wanted me to highlight, which this is the part here, right? That is not the case. So, but if you have your Microsoft application and you have Graph, right? And on the other side, we have Entra ID, that there's actually multiple authorization systems in play. Now, but again, as a sort of outsider, if we put aside roles for a moment, OAuth scopes, OAuth permissions are effectively an absolute, right? If I'm a third-party developer building some application for, Entra M365, whatever is defined here is sort of like I have to take it, and believe it. But Microsoft, right, they have other authorization models that exist as well, right, that some of their first-party applications, as they're sometimes called, right, can use. So effectively, right, when I made the call to Graph for, role management, while it might not have had an OAuth scope, right, there was some other authorization mechanism in play here that allowed that to happen. And so also this list of applications that support OAuth 2 client credential grant flow, it actually is applications that supported OAuth 2 client credential grant flow. So this case did take a while because ultimately Microsoft themselves kind of took the findings after a bit of back and forth and really dug into this. And in the resolution, they've effectively implemented something that is similar to an app instance property lock. And so app instance property lock is a setting on applications that can prevent the assignment of credentials. And while Microsoft doesn't use that, they have another internal mechanism that effectively blocks authentication. So now if we go try to connect as device registration service, right, we're going to get this sort of cryptic error message that tells us something like that the client secret is probably wrong. But ultimately, this is the result of Microsoft dwindling that list down. Now, I will say on this list, you may still find that some of these things like AAD password protection proxy, right, will accept credentials on it. And this is because some of these things have legitimate purposes where, right, it's hybrid identity. You're trying to use password protection with Active Directory and things like that, right? And it needs a credential to, sort of operate in a, Active Directory, Entra ID hybrid mode. So, this still brings me to sort of the defense piece of things. And, right, I think that there's still important bits in here in trying to look for markers, right? Because we did have privilege elevation here. And there are ways we can look for certain markers in Entra ID, right? And now, one aspect of this case is just having been around the block for a while with Entra, knowing that device registration service has existed for, well, it's got to be going on a decade, if not more, right? And I sort of put out there, how long, has this existed for? I think that this probably has existed for as long as device registration service has. I didn't get any refute there, so I was sort of taking the silence as an answer. Right, and ultimately, again, sort of wearing my blue hat, the problem that I had sort of with this finding is because a lot of organizations don't treat the application administrator role as tier 0, right? It's not considered privileged. So we have a lot of these scenarios these days where a threat actor shows up, right, breaches an app admin. On one hand, right, I'm like, this is a bit of a edge case finding. On another, if it's existed for 10 years, right, who knows, who else knows about this and just has never reported it, right? But so an app admin gets popped and then, right, effectively goes through this whole flow. And right then at that point, if Entra's breached, again, you're going to be having a bad day. So a couple things we can do is we can look for suspicious credentials, right? So if there are credentials assigned to device registration service, we can actually run get mg service principal and basically filter for the client ID or app ID, one and the same again, which is globally unique, so everyone can run effectively the same command and look for any key credentials, right, which are going to be certificates assigned to device registration service. And in this example, right, we've got a couple. And the same thing for password credentials or secrets and see if we have anything assigned. Now, obviously, this is not an absolute because, right, if a threat actor removed these after the fact, you wouldn't necessarily know. But we also have the ability to, look through our SIM or SIEM or, whichever you feel like calling it, right? And so here, very simple KQL snippets, right? Where effectively we're looking for device registration service adding users to different roles, right? Because this is behavior that no one should ever see within a tenant. But the unfortunate thing is again, I would say there's probably a decent number of enterprises who would have this behavior if someone did abuse this to gain persistence or a foothold into their tenant where the organization likely would never know that this actually happened. Just there's not enough maturity around identity auditing and correlation of events. And also, aside from looking for operations performed by device registration service, we also have the ability to look again here, very simple KQL snippet, right, to go see if any secrets or credentials have been assigned to the service principal for device registration service. So I know this is a lot. And so if you actually go to shortlink.entra.ms, and I own entra.ms, so if Microsoft is here and wants to buy it, I might sell it to you. / UnOAuthorized, there's a blog article that's published that will have all the sort of details of things that I talked about here. And went through that a bit quick, but I guess that leaves more time for questions. All right. Yeah. Oh yeah. The question. Am I going to post the slides? Yeah. So the slides actually will be on the Black Hat sort of site thing, but I'll also have them up on a GitHub someplace. So. All right, cool. Thank you, everyone.